So good morning, everyone, and welcome to FuseHub's and AIM's virtual cybersecurity self-assessment workshop. My name is Everton, and I'm FuseHub's New York MEP Solutions Director, and I will be your host for today. This event was organized in order to help manufacturers in the DoD supply chain gain understanding of the NIST SP 800-171 requirements and to learn how to do cybersecurity self-assessment along those guidelines. So just a couple of brief housekeeping notes before we begin. This morning's program will run from 9 until 12:30 p.m. and we will conclude the program promptly at 12:30 p.m. The schedule will be as follows. First, we'll have a brief welcome from Corey Albrecht, Director of the Advanced Institute for Manufacturing, which is affectionately called AIM. Next, we will hear from Franca Armstrong. She's the Associate Vice President of Workforce Development and the Dean of the Mohawk Valley Community College's Rome campus in Rome, New York. After that, we'll have our distinguished speaker lineup, who will cover the NIST SP 800-171 in preparation for the actual assessment that you'll be performing today. The first speaker will be our resident cybersecurity expert, Mr. Paul Laporte, the cybersecurity coordinator at AIM, and he will cover sections 3.1 to 3.7. Paul will be followed by our second and third speaker from the Global Cybersecurity Institute at Rochester Institute of Technology, which is RIT. And the first will be Ms. Vivian Stover. She's a cyber range producer and business director at the GCI. And then we'll have Dr. Justin Pelletier. He's a director of the Cybersecurity Range and Training Center. And together they will cover sections 3.8 to 3.12. After this, we will once again be joined by Paul Laporte, who will round out the 14 sections by doing 3.13 to 3.14. Our fourth speaker will be Ms. Anna Volage Fitzsimmons, and she's from PTAC, the Procurement Technical Assistance Center, and she's the program director at the Monroe County Finger Lakes Center. Anna will be speaking to you about PTAC and her assistance and the assistance it provides to DoD manufacturers. Plus, she'll provide some important information on SPRS, the Supplier Performance Risk System. Our final speaker session will include Dr. Pelletier, who will be speaking about the GCI and an upcoming new opportunity there. We'll then close out with an overview of the Cybersecurity Cohort Grants Program from Corey and myself. After that, we'll have a 15-minute break, during which time you can eat, drink, use the bathroom, check your teachable registration, whatever it is that you want to do. After the break, FuseHub's Director of Special Projects, Kim Lloyd, will provide some brief instructions before we're split into 4 separate sections, each to a Zoom room with an expert cyber facilitator and a moderator. Finally, the program for this event, which includes the speaker bios, well, it would be found on our webpage, but that's later. But I think Nick emailed that to all of you this morning, so you should have that. The workshop is being recorded, and you will be able to find it at other cybersecurity recordings at the www.newyorkmep.org website. So thank you for attending, and please sit back, enjoy, and learn. And now we will begin with Corey to do a welcome. So take it away, my friend.
Thank you, Everton, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Cybersecurity Self-Assessment Workshop. As Everton said, my name is Corey Albrecht. I'm the MEP Center Director here for Mohawk Valley Community College's Advanced Institute for Manufacturing. We have an outstanding program here this morning. We have a couple special guest presenters, one from the PTAC program, and we have a couple presentations from the Rochester Institute of Technology. So thank you for taking time out of your very busy days and joining us. And before I send it back to Everton, I have to thank all the manufacturers that we have here in attendance this morning. The work that each and every one of you are doing across the state to contribute to the Department of Defense supply chain is really remarkable work, and I tip my hat to you. Please keep up your strong efforts, and congratulations on all your good work across the state. So with that, hope everybody enjoys the workshop and the program. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. And back to you, Everton.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you. And now we'll ask Franca to say a few words. So Franca, please take it away.
Good morning. Thank you, Everton. Thank you, Corey. Welcome, everyone. I'm Franca Armstrong with Mohawk Valley Community College. Thank you for coming to today's Cybersecurity Self-Assessment Workshop. We are very fortunate at MVCC and AIM to have partners and relationships to pull all of this together for you. I would be remiss if I did not thank Fuse Hub for all of the hard work that they have put into this, and to all of our speakers and presenters today for their knowledge and expertise. Thank you. Cybersecurity is increasingly more important to all that we do every day, and we appreciate the time you're taking to learn more and do more for your company and making manufacturing stronger in New York State. We hope you enjoy and learn a lot today, and you're in great hands with Everton as your host, there's no doubt. So enjoy. Thank you, Everton.
Thank you so much, Franca, for the kind words. It's very, very nice. I'll take this opportunity just to talk to the manufacturers that as I was driving to the office this morning, I realized that what we're doing here is really, really important. You must have heard about the Chinese hacking that went on today. Well, actually, it was yesterday that it was discussed, and it makes it even more important because that was directed at the heart of our defense community. So it's really important that we really learn how to do self-assessment here to help to protect ourselves from these bad actors that are always trying to get to us. But speaking about that, you know, you're going to get some very, very wise words from our lineup of speakers. And the next person that I'll introduce is the inimitable Mr. Paul Laporte, who is our resident cyber expert here at AIM. So Paul, you're up. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Everton, and good morning, everybody. So I am the cybersecurity coordinator for the Advanced Institute for Manufacturing, as Everton mentioned. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to start off the presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and grab notes here. Boom. Okay, we are ready to go. Okay, so for those of you who are coming into this subject completely fresh, without any prior conceived notions, you know, then this is going to act as kind of an introduction for you into the subject. I would like to mention that if anyone out there has their microphones on, just go ahead and mute those. Also, additionally, if you have any questions while we go through this first half of the presentation, reserve those because we are going to go over this material in more detail in depth in the second half of the workshop, where we're actually going to be kind of going more of an item by item breakdown with the different breakout room resources. So, you know, you can just reserve everything for then. But the 800-171, if you are in the Department of Defense supply chain, is something that I'm sure by now you've likely heard about, but if you haven't, it is effectively the standards that are issued as a guideline by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, and with that, we'll move into our first slide here, that provides data, information, guidance on a wide variety of scientific and technological subjects. So NIST covers a lot of things beyond just cybersecurity. They issue technical specifications, things that are IT related, not necessarily just in the cybersecurity field. But the 800-171 specifically provides guidance for protecting what is known as CUI in non-federal systems. And CUI stands for Controlled Unclassified Information. Now, CUI is something that is not necessarily in every contract, but the way that it can be best described in layman's terms is it is essentially information that the government doesn't necessarily want publicly available, but it's not high enough to have received any sort of security clearance requirement. This can apply to a variety of different types of information in regards to measurements for parts, locations for shipping. It can vary. There is more information in regards to what does and doesn't qualify as CUI at the link that's listed there on the presentation for archive.gov. And it is worth noting that the 800-171 is not a certification in and of itself. So it isn't like ISO certification, or as we're starting to see come through the future requirements that we're going to see down the road in the CMMC certification. The 800-171 is not a specific certification. It is just a set of recommended guidelines that have been issued by NIST that the DoD is essentially using to help manufacturers institute what is essentially a foundation of cybersecurity. This is not going to protect you from every single type of attack that's going to exist, but what it's going to do is it's going to make your foundation strong, protect you from the variety of things, from a wide variety of things that do exist, and for anything that may end up happening to you, it'll allow you to get as much information about that, communicate that information to the right people, and help you recover from it as quickly as possible. So taking a look at the 800-171 here, we're going to go through this in much greater detail later on in this presentation and later on in the afternoon. But these are the 14 different families that are made up. So there is 110 items of the 800-171, and they're split out as follows. You'll see that there are different subjects here based on what family there might be. And you'll also notice that they're not all necessarily tied to IT-related subjects. We have physical security, personnel security, awareness and training. These are not just simply IT-related issues. So that's always why I like to stress that in going through this assessment process, you need to have more people than just the IT department involved. The saying is it takes a village to be cyber secure, I suppose. And that's really the case here, as you can see in just an outline of these families. And we'll get into this in more detail later. So another thing you might have heard of in addition to the 800-171 is the DFARS clause 252.204-7012. And this is the actual specific clause in your DoD-related contracts that will essentially tell you that you need to abide by 800-171 requirements. There is a lot of confusion as to whether or not people need to follow 800-171 requirements based on the contracts that they have with the DoD, because again, not every DoD contract contains CUI. I like to say, regardless of whether or not you are required to, it's a good idea to follow the 800-171 just for your own protection for your organization, regardless of whether or not what you're required to do, mandates you. But if you have this clause in your contract, then it is very, very likely that you actually do need to follow these requirements as mandated by either the Department of Defense or your prime contractor that has their own contract with the DoD. And DFARS stands for Defense Federal Acquisition Supplement. I think it's Defense Federal Acquisition Requirement Supplement or Regulation Supplement. But these are the regulations and clauses in government contracts. So again, not necessarily specifically to cybersecurity are all DFARS clauses. It's just this specific clause. And I think most of the clauses in this family, the 252.204 family, these are issued by the Department of Defense, and they require contractors handling CUI to meet 800-171 requirements. And as I mentioned previously, there is no certification for this. This is self-assessed by the holder or applicant of the contract. So whoever is applying for or has the contract, they are the ones who are going to be determining where they stand and where they fall within the 800-171 guidelines. And that is kind of what we're going to try and help you get started on the path to doing today with this workshop. And then later on with the full online training materials that have been provided to you as a result for registering for this event. So the DFARS clause is interesting because it doesn't necessarily state that you have to meet all of the 800-171 requirements to bid on a contract, to work with a contract. But what you need to do is you need to have two things in place. So the first one is a system security plan. The system security plan provides an outline of your current security practices and procedures in place by your company for review by the DoD or your prime contractor. This applies to the 800-171 requirements that are currently being met. So as you go through this 800-171 document and you look at certain items and say, okay, we are doing these things to meet these requirements, those are the items that would go in your system security plan. There's no specific template for this. There is no formal way of doing this. It can be spreadsheets, Word documents. You can use aggregation tools. There's a variety of ways that you can do it, but you need some sort of documentation in relation to the 800-171 and what you're currently doing to meet requirements. The second part of the DFARS clause requires you to have a plan of action with milestones or a POAM. And this provides an outline of the security practices and policies in need of remediation. So the things that you are not currently doing, the items of the 800-171 that you do not meet the requirements of, these need to be outlined in this second part, this POAM. And what they need to do is they need to detail the steps that you are planning on taking to resolve this issue and actually meet the 800-171 requirements, as well as a timeline for when you intend on doing so. And if there's certain steps that you need to implement on the way to getting to those requirements, then they want to see those milestones, the outline of those, of that timeline that you have listed. So for example, if you have a server infrastructure that is running an out-of-date version of Windows Server and you need to upgrade it. So, the examples of milestones would be, purchasing the server by a certain date, purchasing the software by a following date, migrating everything over by the final date. Those would be an example of just a very brief example of the milestones that you would have. So the DFARS clause states that you need to either have the system security plan outlining what you're doing and a plan of action detailing what needs to be done. And that is what is going to satisfy the Department of Defense or your prime contractor and satisfy this DFARS clause. Now, as I mentioned, in getting enrolled and signing up for this event, you have actually been enrolled into our full online training course, which is it's a 15-part online training program, which features lecture and quizzes for each of the 800-171 families, as well as some extra stuff at the end for CMMC. So if you come here looking for information and specifically regarding CMMC, there's some extra items at the end that'll kind of help you get there, as well as all the other items that are needed for 800-171. If you have logged into that Teachable account, that link was sent to you over the past probably couple days or so, past day or two, you will see that in the beginning, there's a section called Course Resources. Inside that specific section of the program, there are a couple different downloads for you that you can make use of, including even as you go through this workshop event today. So the first is the NIST Handbook 162. This is a summary of all the 800-171 requirements. It provides some clarification and explanation, as well as questionnaires for each of the different items for the 800-171. So again, if you're planning on tackling this assessment within your organization, or in tandem with any sort of third-party IT contractor that you've been working with, this is a good resource for you to kind of get going on that road in combination with everything else that we're offering today and in the online course. Additionally included in that initial resource folder is an 800-171 self-assessment worksheet. And this is just, again, a spreadsheet of all 110 items that will allow you to actually fill in the different areas and help keep track of your progress as you go through this. Now, obviously, with the limited amount of time we have today, you're not going to be able to get through an entire 800-171 self-assessment, especially because you're probably going to need to make contact with other people in your organization, maybe refer to some documentation that you may or may not have. But what the worksheet will allow you to do is, while you're going through this presentation and the workshop later on in the afternoon, it'll allow you to kind of make notes on what you may need to pay some extra attention to, maybe what you may need to go back to, what you might need to focus on. And then once you've actually gone through the process of completing your self-assessment, and if you fill this entire worksheet out, this can be used as a template for your system security plan and your plan of action, because you're going to be going through and kind of marking in the dropdown what requirements you're meeting, which ones you're not meeting, and so on. And then by the end, you'll have a pretty clear overview of the things that you're meeting for your system security plan and the things that you're not for your plan of action. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into the actual meat and potatoes of the 800-171. And in doing this presentation, what we're going to be doing, at least for this first part of the workshop, for specifically the sections I'm covering, rather than looking at each of the individual items, because we have so much to cover in such a short amount of time, we're going to be looking more at some key concepts that are sort of repeating factors in each of the individual families that come up. So these are kind of the most important things that you're going to need to meet the requirements of the majority of the items in each of these individual families. Again, when we get into the second part of this workshop, where we're actually going to go into breakout rooms and have the individual cybersecurity resources, that's going to be more of a number by number breakdown. But right now, we just want to take a high level overview just to kind of get the gears turning. And if you have any questions or concerns or something seems like it's something you may want to focus on, then we can kind of have that preloaded for the second half of the workshop. So the first item that we're going to be looking at is family 3.1, and that deals specifically with access control. And this really determines how the employees who are accessing this information that we're trying to protect actually gain access to that information. And in the most common terms, that is in regards to how they log into their servers, how they log into their computers, what they have to do to get a hold of those files and folders. And the first concept I want to look at is the concept of identity management. And simply put, this is what's required for users to authenticate. And most commonly, that's a username and a password. So if somebody has to put in that information to log into their computer each morning, or to log into a server that contains the information via, most commonly for IT-related people out there, Windows Server and Active Directory, then this would fall under what would be required of them. We do want them to have some sort of means of putting in some sort of verification of who they are to access that information. And again, most commonly, that's a username and a password through some sort of centralized environment. Additionally, identity management it lends a hand in tracking user activity. So in addition to making sure people say who they are when they log in to give them permission to access that information, it also aids in tracking what our employees are doing with that information. And that is an important concept that kind of comes out throughout the 800-171. In addition to making sure that we're keeping our information secure, we also want to know what people are doing with it, including the people that we give permission to access those files. So tracking user activity is another important part of identity management that we have to consider. And it's another important reason why we want people to log in and have some sort of identity tied to them when they're getting a hold of the CUI or whatever other information we're trying to protect. Another important key concept for 3.1 is the concept of lease privilege. And this is the idea that we want to restrict access to files and systems based on the need of the employee. So we want to make sure that employees don't have access to information that they don't need to do their day-to-day duties. Because the more information that any one person has access to, the more valuable that makes their account. So if somebody has access to all of the information in the company and their account gets compromised, that can be devastating for an organization. But if somebody in the engineering department gets compromised, then the attacker would have the ability to access those engineering files, but not necessarily the files for accounting or human resources or anything like that. So it helps kind of mitigate the damage that's done in the event that somebody gets compromised. Additionally, when looking specifically at CUI, if we can put just the people who are working on those CUI related projects into their own group, then we can further segment and protect that information. So only those people would be able to access that information, and then we can give those people an additional level of training, and they can have another level of expertise and understanding of what they need to protect. And again, in both of these cases, this can be done either via setting permissions individually, so determining by a person-by-person case basis who can access what, or you can split people up into user groups by department or by project that you're working on in order to, set permissions that way at a group level. Information flow is another important key concept that we want to take a look at. And information flow, simply put, verifies and secures the travel and storage of information. So again, this just basically is keeping track of the information that is flowing across your network, where that information is going, where it's being stored, who has access to it, if it has the ability to leave your network, what are the rules that are in place for that. And this can be achieved via a variety of network protection devices, logging equipment, procedures and policies as well. Again, all of these things set those rules, but in addition to, as I mentioned before, making sure that your information is secure, we want a clear idea at all times of where that information is going and who is doing what to it. It's very important when keeping security in mind, and also determining, what happened in the event that there was some sort of incident in our organization. Another concept that we're looking at is separation of duties. So separation of duties, again, we're looking at providing privileged functions dividing privileged functions among multiple employees. So this is ensuring that no one employee has the ability to do something malicious, whether it's the employee themselves or somebody who has compromised the employee's account. It's making sure that no one employee has the ability to do something malicious and then cover their own tracks. So, it's really the idea of checks and balances. If you look at our government, if one person has the ability to make changes to user accounts, maybe you want another person who has the ability to review the logs that control those permissions that were set and determine who is doing that sort of activity. So the same person can't do something bad and then cover up their tracks. Additionally, this can apply to just making sure that general employees do not have full control over their own individual machines, because then if they can do things at their own machine level, then that can not only compromise the information on their computer, but the information on other people's devices and on the wider network as a whole. So making sure that we have responsibilities and duties separated amongst multiple individuals is a very important concept when it comes to cybersecurity. Account security, another key concept here. Again, just making sure that we have blocks in place to prevent or restrict unauthorized access to CUI. So for those accounts that we do have set up for all of our users, but again, specifically concerning ones that can access our CUI or any sort of privileged information, we want to make sure that we're doing extra steps to keep their account secure in the event that somebody is trying to gain access to them that shouldn't. And that can come in a variety of ways. Just a couple examples I have here. The first is limiting unsuccessful logon attempts, which we probably all run into in one way or another, where if you try to log into an account, you put in the wrong password so many times, eventually it'll lock you out completely and go, okay, you have to contact your administrator, or okay, you have to reset your password, something along those lines. Additionally, we could have session timeouts for our users. So we are actually setting controls at the server level typically, where if a person gets up and leaves their computer for so long and their computer is idle, it will lock their computer so somebody can't just sit down and then act as though they were that person. And then the 800-171 also recommends an additional level of security beyond that, where if a person is gone for a prolonged period of time, so greater than an hour, 2 hours, something along those lines, it'll actually log that user off completely and bring the computer back to essentially the first state for where they turned on the computer in the morning. This again, it prevents people from having longer periods of time to attempt to guess a person's password or do something along those lines, where they would be able to access their information really quickly after succeeding in doing so. Privacy and security notices are another important thing to consider, making sure that there is some sort of notice or warning that information being accessed contains CUI. This is a warning that is provided to our employees, more of a reminder really, just to say, hey, be sure you know that this information that you're handling is important and you should give it an extra level of care. This can be done either via login pop-ups. So when they first log into the computer in the morning, you could say, hey, you're accessing privileged information. Be sure you're aware of that. And it can also be in the area of company non-disclosure agreements. So when they first join the organization, you can sign a non-disclosure agreement that says, hey, by working here, you handle a certain level of information. You should not be sharing it with other people. Remote access controls, making sure that we are focused on monitoring and securing outside connections. This is especially important these days with so many people working from home. But anybody who is doing any sort of remote desktop work, has a VPN connection into the company network, that's working from a different office or working out of their home, we want to make sure that there's extra controls and monitoring in place for those employees. Because again, if you can access your network from the outside world, that opens yourself up to a much wider variety of attackers. Wireless network control. If you have a wireless network within your organization, you want to make sure that you are securing those wireless connections. So only the people who need to can access your systems that contain CUI. You want to make sure that those connections are properly encrypted and secured so nobody can hang around on your network and intercept the information that's passing across your devices. You also want to make sure that there are policies in place regarding mobile device connection. Rules outlining for employees who can and can't access the wireless network, what devices they can and can't connect, whether or not they can connect personal devices, and if you have a guest network, what network they can connect those devices to. CUI encryption. So if you have any sort of CUI that is being stored on a mobile device, something that leaves your facility, so a laptop, cell phone, tablet, removable media, anything along those lines, you want to make sure that it has undergone some sort of encryption to lock the information up that will prevent access to the CUI in the event that the device is stolen. If a person's laptop is stolen out of their bag, or their whole bag is snatched from them, you want to make sure that if that person tries to gain access to the information on it, that they're not able to access that CUI or that important information because it has undergone some sort of encryption method. External system controls. So this is regarding the usage of systems not owned or controlled by the company, and it prohibits the storage of CUI on personal or public devices. So again, if employees are using their own devices or bringing their own devices into work, so their own personal laptops, anything along those lines, that introduces an extra level of risk because we have less control over those devices. We don't know what they're doing with those devices in their own homes. We don't know what are on those devices that might be malicious. So we want to make sure that there are rules in place stating what can and can't be stored on personal devices and what extra steps of precaution need to be taken in the event that we want that information to be stored on things that are not fully controlled by the company. And then finally, for this particular family, publicly accessible systems. So we want to make sure that systems that are owned by the company, that are meant to be interacted with by the public and not just our individual employees, things like web servers, email servers, file transfer servers for customers, online marketplaces, anything like that. We want to make sure that those things are closely reviewed and scrutinized, and that those systems do not contain any sort of CUI or any sort of critical information that we wouldn't want shared with the public. We want to make sure that that information is protected and reserved for our employees and the people who need to handle it, and that it should not be available anywhere else. So that was the first family. The first family is actually the biggest one. It makes up roughly about 1/5 of the entire overall requirements. So we're about 20% of the way there. So it's funny how they kind of really front load the 800-171 with a lot of very critical and important information up front. And then the rest is kind of spread out a little more evenly. But as we get into family 3.2, it's actually interesting because this one covers specifically awareness and training. So whereas we looked at kind of more technical things in the last family, this is all specifically regarding how our employees handle this information. So the rules that we're putting in place for them, and the training that we're communicating those rules to our employees by. And this family is actually the smallest family in the entire 800-171 document, but I personally believe that it's the most important because our employees understanding and taking responsibility for the information that they handle is going to do so much more for securing our company as opposed to just throwing money at the problem and just trying to lock down everything through technological means. So the first thing that we want to look at when we're looking at family 3.2 is building policies. So we want to define and document rules for computer usage, information handling, and incident response. Policies should be constructed with help from the IT administrators, HR department, and other departmental supervisors. So again, these are really the rules that we're setting in place for our employees as far as what information they're handling, so they understand that, how to handle it, so where to store it, who to send it to, and if there's extra information or extra care that needs to be considered for things like CUI, how those rules differ from the general rules for regular information that employees are handling. And here we just have some kind of examples of policies that we would see in a sound cybersecurity section of an employee handbook. So again, defining the usage in handling and what is CUI. So like what projects it may be associated with, what areas of the network that CUI may reside on, what systems might hold CUI. All of those things should be outlined in policies. Company PC usage. So just general PC usage requirements and guidelines for employees as far as what's acceptable. Usage of company devices should be outlined in your policies. Incident response and help desk requests. So if employees have an issue, whether that's IT related or security related, who do they go to? How do they do it? What's the process for that? Visitor and guest policies. So what are the policies for people who are coming into our facilities or working at or coming into our organization that don't work for us? We want to make sure that those are outlined. Do those people need to be supervised? Are they logging their visit via some sort of sign book at the entry? Is there a specific entrance they need to go into? Those things should all be outlined as well. Public information and privacy policies. So again, what information is publicly is okay to release to the public? What information do we want to keep private, and what are the rules associated with that? Physical information and clean desk policies. So again, CUI doesn't necessarily need to just be digital. It can be on paper. And in the event that it is, we want to make sure that there are rules in place for handling that specific information and handling that paper. And then finally, personal device usage policy. So again, as we mentioned, if companies are going to bring in their own, if employees are going to bring in their own devices and companies are going to allow that sort of behavior, what are the rules that are in place for that? So once we have those policies in place, we want to make sure that we're actually providing training to our employees. And this training is going to officially and effectively communicate policies to our employees and provide them with the education needed to handle information, prevent attacks from happening, and to spot potential threats before they become a larger issue. The communication of these policies wants to detail the company policies and best practices. So again, those rules that we've established in our policies, we want to communicate to our employees what those rules are via some sort of formal training, not just say, hey, here, read through the handbook, let us know when you're done. We want to actually sit them down with human resources, with our IT department, with supervisors, whoever that may be, people who can communicate these rules to our incoming and existing employees effectively, so there's no confusion and everybody understands what they need to do. The policies can also instruct employees on using tools. So if you have certain programs or mechanisms that you use to protect your information, it can provide instructions to employees on how to actually use those things. And communication of the policies through training is going to ensure that all of our employees understand the rules that are in place for them and provide clarification and answers to any questions that they might have. So again, if you just hand an employee your rule book, then, or your employee handbook, your guidebook, whatever you want to call it, they're going to read through it and they'll get some of it, but they probably won't get all of it. And they may not feel entirely comfortable just searching someone out and asking them questions, or they'll feel like if they have questions, then their supervisor will think that they're not paying attention or anything like that. You really want some sort of formal training process that kind of takes the pressure off of employees, makes them feel comfortable with the rules that they have to follow, and make sure that there's no blind spots or misinformation that they might have regarding that. And again, this training can be conducted by a mixture of our human resources team, our IT administrators, and our supervisors. Additionally, this employee training should also include an element of insider threat training. So this is special consideration that should be given to damaging and malicious attacks by people within the organization. So employees, contractors, other vendors, anything along those lines, people who have an extra level of privilege and access to our information beyond just the general public. We have to consider what attacks from them may look like, because those attacks can be far and away the most devastating because they have the greatest access of information. And when we see attacks that tend to happen within companies, whether it is intentional or not, usually somewhere along the line, some of that information was released by somebody working within the company. Either it was somebody who didn't understand the policies properly and accidentally released it, or it was somebody who had some sort of vendetta or was disgruntled, and then released the information as a result of that. We want to make sure that we have some sort of training for our employees to detail what suspicious activity might look like, so they will know to look out for it. So some examples could be just attempting to access information that doesn't relate to their work, unusual behavior, change in habits. So maybe they're trying to access the building at weird times of day, or they're trying to gain access to somebody else's account information, something along those lines. There's a variety of indicators. It can vary from organization to organization, but in any case, the training wants to emphasize the reporting and outline the contact point if somebody sees something that seems suspicious. So who do we go to? What's the sort of procedure put in place for reporting an incident if somebody within the company is doing something that they're not supposed to? So that's Family 3.2, again, shorter, but there's a lot of meat within there, and we'll probably touch on it a little bit more in depth in the second half of the workshop. But now we're moving along to Family 3.3, Audit and Accountability. So this entirely looks at what we are doing in terms of tracking our employees' activity and the activity of the files and information that exists on our network. So that can come in a couple different varieties as far as what tools we're using to keep track of that. The first are server logs. So these are records that track our activity on our file server. These can be filtered out according to individual users, specific user groups, if we've set user groups at the permission level for our administrators, or it can be file locations, so specific areas of our network. You can filter it in a variety of ways. The most common tool that's used for server logs is Windows Event Viewer, which is built right into Windows Server operating systems. There are third-party software aggregation tools for logs that will provide a little bit cleaner output, maybe some extra filtering details. So you can look to spend a little bit more money for a little increased convenience, but there are native tools built right into usually the systems that we have in place that will allow us to track this sort of activity. Network logs. So this is specifically looking at the travel of information and the travel of users across our network. So network logs should show internal and external communication for devices. So what is happening inside of our network within our offices, and then what's happening outside of our network as far as remote workers, people trying to access our network from the outside world, things along those lines. Logging is typically built into firewalls and networking equipment. So again, as far as the tools you have in place, you probably have some sort of device in place that is or has the ability to generate logs, but they may not be active or properly configured. So again, this is where we may need to look within our own organization and see what tools we have currently and whether or not we're utilizing them to the best of their ability. Another concept in Family 3.3 is log retention and review. So we're generating those logs, and that's good, but we want to actually take a look at them at some point. And we want to make sure that those logs are being kept around. System and network logs containing CUI, so for any servers or networks that would have CUI on it, should be created for all devices and all networks, and should be retained for a minimum of 30 days and a recommended minimum of 1 year. So at least 30 days, ideally up to a year, really ideally beyond that, just so we have a very clear record and a history of what is going on with our CUI. These logs should be reviewed on a regular, proactive basis. So again, we shouldn't be just going back and looking at these logs if there is a problem within our company. We should be reviewing them proactively in the event that something is happening that seems like it might be suspicious, but isn't enough to really cause a problem or generate any sort of red flags. Logs should be reviewed ideally once a month on a recommended basis. If you have a smaller organization, maybe you can get away with, every other month or once a quarter. If you're a very small company, if you're a larger company, maybe you want to do it once every couple of weeks or once a week. And then we want to make sure that the activity on our network, as we mentioned earlier, is uniquely traced. So making sure that logs can trace activity accurately at the server and network level to unique individuals. So when we're looking through those logs, we can very clearly identify who is doing what on our network, and we have a reasonable level of confidence that we can clearly identify all of the activity and all the people who are operating and handling our CUI. We want to make sure that we have one user and ideally one device per employee with access to CUI. So again, that just gives us the clearest idea of the account that a person is using. We don't want multiple people using the same account. Again, if they're handling CUI, ideally, we don't even want multiple people using the same device for network tracking purposes. And we want to make sure that those people have their own unique identifiers if they're accessing that privileged level of information. Reviewing audited events. So again, periodically examining monitored systems and users to determine if changes need to be made. So just kind of looking over our logs and our security practices and principles and seeing if they're still up to standard, if anything has changed, if we've had a bunch of new employees come in, or we've introduced some sort of new system into our organization. Is everything still sufficient? And do we need to potentially make any changes? And this review can be done monthly or quarterly or more or less if needed. Again, if there has been some sort of big change within your organization or your organization hasn't really changed very much recently, that can be increased or decreased. Audit process failure alerts. So making sure that the logging systems are configured to alert the administrator if, number one, if they stop working. So if logs are no longer being generated, we want to have some sort of alert generated to the administrators so they can fix that. And then additional alerts can be configured for defined events. So if there's certain things that seem suspicious, if somebody is trying to access our network from a different country that we don't do business in, or at a strange time of day, that can trigger an alert to our administrators to investigate that further. And then timestamp validity. Another thing that's important, we want to make sure that for the timestamps that are being generated on our logs, that those systems are synchronizing with network time protocol or NTP servers to within 1 second. So we have a very clear and confident idea of the time that these events took place. So we can have confidence in the validity of those logs when we're reviewing them in terms of determining the time that events took place. And then finally, logging integrity, making sure that logging systems are only accessed by authorized individuals such as IT admins, security officers, etc., that the modification and deletion of audit logs should be discouraged whenever possible and heavily scrutinized. So we really should not be changing or deleting our logs for any reason unless it's an extreme circumstance. We really want just a clear, solid record of everything that takes place. And as mentioned previously, we want to consider the separation of IT and admin logging, or the IT administration and logging administration, if at all possible. So we have one person handling general IT stuff, another person monitoring the logs, again, just to kind of talk about that separation of duties. Family 3.4 deals with configuration management. So this talks specifically about how we are configuring and protecting the configurations of the systems within our network. First thing we want to do is we make sure that we establish a baseline for our systems. So we have a kind of record of what the normal state is of our devices in place. So we want to take stock of the current systems and software installed on those systems. We want to include security configurations as part of the baseline. We want to make sure that we're documenting baselines and updating changes as they're made. And we want to highlight any unauthorized changes for further analysis. So again, we want to make sure that we know the normal state for all our machines. If something needs to change, we want to analyze that. And then we want to make sure that nobody can make changes to our systems unless they have approval to do so. Reviewing and authorizing system changes. So determining who is authorized to make changes to systems, whether it's the IT admins, supervisors, officers, any specific engineers who might need escalated privileges to access testing or machine programs, things along those lines. We want to ensure that all changes to the systems require approval by an authorized individual. So no changes can be made to our operating system or no software can be installed unless we actually review and approve it. And we want to make sure that we're analyzing the impact of security prior to implementing the changes. So if we're instituting any sort of new systems or anything like that, we want to make sure that we're considering how that's going to affect our security. Define, document, and approve physical changes. So we want to make sure that anybody who is making any changes to hardware and devices, that is documented and defined just as our software would be. Maybe the people who are doing this differ from who is actually installing and managing our software. If that's the case, then we want to make sure that those people are highlighted and that those authorized individuals or teams or departments are documented, so we know who has that escalated level of access within our company. And then finally, for this family, we want to make sure that we are applying least functionality principles to system changes. Again, we discussed a lot about this previously, making sure employees only have access to the information that they need to, restrict and disable non-essential programs, functions, ports, etc., making sure that we have some sort of blacklisting or whitelisting software in the event that employees do need to install their own software for whatever reason. We still want extra controls in place, and that we want to make sure that approval is required for anybody who is a non-approved or non-security minded user when they're installing their software. Moving on to family 3.5, identification and authentication. First thing we want to do, again, making sure that we're verifying our user identity, using our identity management systems like Windows Server, making sure that we are authenticating, and that is a requirement to access our information and our CUI. Beyond that, multi-factor authentication is very important. And this is something that I'm going to talk more heavily about in the second half. But this basically states that you want to have, in addition to your username and password, at least one other method of verifying who a person is. And that can be through a variety of means that do not include a username and a password. Privileged versus non-privileged accounts, we want to make sure that we have that delineation. Who has the ability to make changes to our systems? Who has access to an escalated level of information? All of those things very important. Network versus local access. So who requires multi-factor authentication remotely versus who requires it within the office. And we want to make sure that that multi-factor authentication is replay resistant, so it's not susceptible to being reused. Again, we'll talk about that a little more later on in the workshop. And finally, we want to, not finally, but moving on, we want to identify best practices. So making sure, again, that we are using unique identifiers for employees, that we're avoiding reuse of identifiers across within multiple people or across multiple systems. And we want to make sure that anybody who hasn't operated on our network in a little while, that their account is reviewed and disabled if it's no longer needed. Really quick discussion on best practices for passwords here. So making sure that we have proper length and complexity for our passwords. Again, we'll get into this more in the second half, and making sure that we have proper character length, complexity. Rotation actually isn't a requirement anymore, so you don't need to change your password every 60 or 90 days. We'll talk about that more later on. Prohibiting password reuse, so making sure that we are not allowing people to recreate old passwords until they've created 24 other ones beyond that. Providing temporary passwords for new users and resets of passwords for employees who may have forgotten theirs. Making sure that if we are storing passwords, which in general isn't a great idea, but if we need to keep records of passwords, that those records are encrypted or secured in some way. And then making sure that when employees are typing in their information into the password fields, that it's not just regular letters, it's stars, asterisks, blank spaces, something along those lines. Moving on to family 3.6, incident response. So this is specifically regarding how we report incidents within our organizations that may come up. So if something does happen while our employees are operating on their day-to-day duties, how do they report that? Who do they report that to? Where do they go to report that? There should be some documentation of that incident, whether it is done manually, so via just typing it into a Word document, using some sort of specific email inbox that's dedicated for support tickets, or you can use a more sophisticated solution like a managed ticketing system to keep track of those incidents as reported. And when employees report those incidents, we want to make sure that the IT or the designated security team are documenting those incidents fully. So they are documenting the incidents that came in, the initial problems that were reported, the response to those problems, so what the IT or the security department has done, and then what the resolution was, and then ideally what the root cause of that was if it wasn't plainly obvious. We want to make sure that that documentation of those incident reports is retained for as long as possible. Again, minimum of 1 year, ideally indefinitely. And this will act as a good method of presenting evidence in the event that we need to show to a contractor or to the DoD that we've been compromised, but that we had a handle on it and that we did everything we could as quickly as we could to help resolve the issue. You know, we can provide them with evidence of here's what came in, here's what was done, here's how it was resolved, here's how we're preventing from happening again. All of that comes in this incident response documentation. And then finally, for this family, we want to make sure that we are testing our incident response capabilities. So employees are being tested on how to use this system. This can be done via simulations. So phishing tests, phishing simulations, leaving thumb drives around and seeing if anybody picks them up and plugs them in, things like that. They can be tabletop exercises, so just sitting down with an employee and running through some scenarios, or they can be checklists that employees are given so they understand how to use these incident response handling systems in the event that they need to report something to our IT department or our security team. You can also test the IT or security team itself to see how they respond to an incident and how well they document the response to that incident as well. So we want to really try and kind of kick the tires from our incident response procedures on both ends. And then moving into family 3.7, which is dealing with maintenance, specifically looking at how we upkeep our information systems that handle our CUI. And from a practical standpoint, the first thing that we're considering is maintaining our devices and our equipment. So we're making sure that we are updating and maintaining all of our devices, including the hardware and the software, making sure that they're fully supported and that they're patched with security updates as those come through. We want to make sure that the equipment, if it is leaving our facility, is properly sanitized. So this can be done via some sort of wiping software or sanitization software, or it can be done by physically destroying older disks, can be degaussed or demagnetized. But we want to make sure that if anything is leaving our facility that contains CUI in it previously, that it is properly removed that CUI via some sort of sophisticated and proper method. And then finally, we are looking at controlling maintenance tools, techniques, and equipment. So making sure that we are restricting maintenance functions to our administrators only. So again, making sure that general employees cannot make changes to our systems that we are not approving of. We want to make sure that if employees are doing maintenance remotely, so our administrators are doing maintenance over a network, that they are doing so via multi-factor authentication and making sure that their remote sessions are properly protected. Because again, if our administrator accounts get compromised, that is incredibly bad for our organization because those accounts have a ton of power. And if we have anybody who is doing any sort of outside maintenance, so anybody who is doing work on like our copiers, or if we have any third-party contractors who don't regularly do work within our systems, we want to make sure that when they're in our facilities and they're working on our devices, that they're properly supervised by our employees or security team or whoever that may be, because again, we're giving them extra levels of access to our information. And whenever we do that, we want to make sure that we are giving them an extra level of scrutiny and an extra level of security that is required when they are granted access to those specific devices. So those are the first 7 families of the NIST 800-171. I have been talking for a good while now, so I'm going to take a little bit of a break, and I'm going to turn it over to our colleagues at the Rochester Institute of Technology, starting off with Justin Pelletier. Justin, you can go ahead and take it away from here.
Thanks, Paul. That's a lot of great information that you just delivered. And one of the things that I think, just as a little bit of a segue between the different families of controls, I think, for those that are watching and maybe haven't seen this before, there's a lot of overlap of those concentric circles of the families. So, as you described in the first one, these things tend to get more detailed and played out a little further in the subsequent families. And so I'm going to emphasize some of the things that you said and maybe add a little bit of detail along the way for the programs that I'll cover, and then I'll turn it over to Vivian Stover, who will elaborate on some as well. So with all that said, let me share my screen and we'll dive right in here. So first up is family 3.8, media protection. So with media protection in particular, you've got really a couple of types of media, right? You have digital media like diskettes and tapes and removable hard drives and flash drives and compact discs and digital video and so on, and non-digital media like paper and even microfilm, which is probably an afterthought for a lot of companies, but there's legacy information there and still an effective way to store things. So the core requirement, you see it here, I've broken out the protection requirements, the basic security requirements within the family. And so if you follow along in 800-171, you'll see this is actually the kind of the categories of protection requirements. And so I'll just kind of elaborate on them and help you follow along in the document itself if you're doing that as we go through. In any case, the basic idea here is you want to limit access to the, for the, design specifications, for the content itself, and make sure that you're protecting the media from unauthorized access. And you want to think about how to limit the access to the necessary team only. Right, but this is an overlapping concern. So that idea of need to know and sort of access control listing, you might consider the project leader, folks on the development team exclusively for design specifications, on the implementation team for different components. One thing that you'll hear me talk a little bit about is the idea of permission creep, which is very common for mature organizations that have seen folks kind of move through the organization. But maintaining active access control lists on folks who leave the team, conducting inventories, maintaining accountability, checking in and out for the media. You can have a sign in, sign out roster. That can help, as well as locking the actual storage container, a drawer, a desk, a cabinet, or having a set space like a locker where you keep these things, a controlled media library or some form of a storage medium and behind a cage or something that's got good access control. These are all good ways to do that. There's follow-on, just like so these families overlap. Well, the NIST publications overlap too. So what we're talking about here is further described in NIST 800-111. Which has guidance on storage encryption technologies for end user devices. And there's a lot of overlap between the NIST documentation. That's sort of a progressive depth concept. So there's a few references that you'll see throughout, and it's there if you want to get smarter on it. For the next one, limiting access to authorized users. I talked about permission creep already. When folks leave the team, and I'll talk more about this with personnel security, but when folks leave the team, it's a good idea to change your passwords, combinations, and keys. When you have really two cases I've seen that this is a particular concern. It's a good idea always, right? But you don't have time to do everything. So if you have to prioritize, when you overhaul all of your access control, when you change all the passwords and issue all new keys, there's an expense associated with resources and time to do all that. So when you have a program manager leave, right? When you have your key, your head of facilities who controls all the keys, or the team lead who had all the access control, the rosters, when they leave, right? And folks with adverse personnel actions, somebody that gets fired, you want to make sure that you're changing the locks because they could end up coming back and causing trouble. So those are the two sort of really need to have cases, but generally it's a best practice to periodically revisit who you consider an authorized user, so that you don't have that permission creep take root in your organization. And then for the last component of this slide, the 383.
You can go now.
Oh, I think we got a hot mic. We have Paul, I think you've got a hot mic. Paul Valentine. For 383, sanitization. There's a few mechanisms for sanitizing devices and media. So Paul hit on this a little bit with degaussing and wiping the files and so on. There's really a few best practices for destruction And sanitizing is a little bit different. That's, certainly destruction will accomplish the same end, but really the idea of redaction is probably a near neighbor to what you might think of with sanitization. Really, you're destroying the specific traces of controlled unclassified information on the system. So first I'll talk about destruction because it's the easiest, right? And if you can, that's probably the easiest and most effective way to sanitize, to just, make sure that you don't have spillage or leaks of the controlled unclassified information after you don't need it anymore. So if you have paper documents, cross-cut shredding is a standard. You can degauss a drive with a big magnet. Thermal destruction is very common as well. That's burning or melting. You can even, if you have an old compact disc or similar, digital disc, you can even throw it in the microwave and that'll destroy it. It's actually a little light show too. I wouldn't recommend letting your kids do that if they're unattended, but it is kind of a fun thing. Don't put other things in the microwave. Don't put your computer in the microwave, but a CD-ROM actually, or CD, I should say, will work, as well as chemical destruction, right? So you can pour lye over something and it'll destroy it. Also, this is probably unwarranted for controlled unclassified information, but chewing and swallowing paper is actually a form of chemical destruction because it materially changes the composition of the thing. So you can think about that from a, you can compost the paper and that becomes a chemical destruction technique that's, ecologically friendly and all that. It takes some time, obviously, but that is a valid destruction mechanism. One quick note with burning, a lot of folks, hey, I'll just burn it. I'll get a burn barrel. I've seen this happen. And it's unfortunate. I mean, you got to make sure that you have appropriate protective gear if you decide to take that route. Really good breathing filtration and eye protection for the folks. And you got to turn it. I mean, it turns into a chore. It seems simple until you start doing it, and then it's like, wow, that's really a bit of a chore. But anyway, so that's destruction, right? Probably the simplest is cross-cut shredding. Unless you really want to have fun, with the other mechanisms, I suppose. Right, physical redaction. So there's two forms of redaction that I'll talk about: physical and digital. So physical redaction, that can be difficult because the act of printing or imprinting something on a piece of paper can leave an impression, and that impression can be retrievable, and even slight deviations in color of ink or whatever the coloring medium is can be if you look at it in the right light, you can actually see, even if you're scribbling it out and so on, just a little bit of a tint change on the ink that you're using to scribble can reveal the information to the plain eye. And if you turn it over and so on, you can do that. And of course, you can apply some chemical treatment that will react with some types of ink versus others and so on, and that will obviate your attempt to sanitize the information, to redact it on physical. So it can be done, but it is difficult. Similar with digital redaction, Paul talked about this a little bit with wiping. And so in case you didn't know, when you delete a file digitally, generally what happens is the address block that your computer used to reference that compartment of information in the physical device, it just frees up the address block. It doesn't actually overwrite anything. And you have an ability to retrieve those information through forensics kits like Encase, or even through a bootable flash drive like a Linux USB that you boot to, and then it mounts the hard drive as a file system. Then you can navigate it. It's not quite so easy as all that, but it isn't that difficult, and it can be done. So best practices include actually going through a secure deletion like CCleaner or Eraser. Microsoft Windows has a built-in function called Cipher, which you can run from the command line. So these tools make it where they actually wipe clean the available unused hard disk space. So all those free memory blocks, address blocks, you just go in and kind of reinitialize them all, and that gets rid of the information. You can find more information, like I said, there's overlapping requirements and so on with the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA. They maintain policy and guidance control and sanitization and so on. NIST 800 TAC 88 has guidance on media sanitization. All right, so that's a lot for a few bullets. Let's keep going. All right, so there's in the document you'll see basic security requirements, and then you see derived security requirements. So the derived security requirements tend to have a bit more overlap with the other functions, but Paul mentioned this. The markings. You have to have markings for controlled unclassified information. So I'm not going to belabor this, but in general, the designation for controlled unclassified information, it consolidates the alphabet soup that we used to see across the government. And there's actually a push within the government to increasingly use CUI instead of all these, for official use only, sensitive but unclassified, sensitive security information, critical infrastructure information, sensitive homeland security information, law enforcement sensitive. There's a whole slew, and you have like a glossary of your acronyms. So that's all rolling up. That all rolls up under CUI, controlled unclassified information, and it allows for the government to share controlled unclassified information with the contract community and have some support in that way. Additional controls that apply to marking include protected health information and Privacy Act data. Those are still specifically marked, even with CUI, because there's additional legal controls that apply to them. There's additional, executive orders and so on, and you'll get this from, as you process this, you should know from your liaison who, which ones apply to the information. The last thing I'll mention on this idea of marking is distribution limitations. They still apply, or they may also apply, I guess is the right way to put that. And so some of them are shareable outside of the United States, to non-US persons. Common, you'll see a Five Eyes community or Four Eyes community or no foreign. No foreign means no non-US persons. Five Eyes and Four Eyes are specific sharing agreements that we have with the Commonwealth partners like the UK and Australia and so on, Canada. So that you'll see those distribution limitations. You'll also see sometimes originator controlled, which means you got to go back to the agency that gave you the information and to make sure that you can share it with some other agency. But those are the types of markings that you'll see and you're required to maintain. A little bit about the next bullet, controlling access to media. We talked about this a little bit, access control, the markings. In general, when you're transporting outside of a controlled area, having a locked container and cryptography for digital media is quite useful, and that can be solved relatively simply. And you can demonstrate an abundance of caution if you use best practices from even more sensitive information like courier cards and courier bags and double wrapping. So you have your marking. It says you get your controlled unclassified information cover sheet, and then you wrap it again with something that's unmarked so that if you're for whatever reason your bag comes loose on the subway or whatever, you don't, it's not like, oh, I got some sensitive information here and now you're now you're getting everybody's attention. It just looks like plain old thing in a regular old folder. Who cares? But having a locked courier bag, it's very, very similar to what you see in the financial community with carrying money. It's just a key with the bag with a key. One quick note about encryption. Paul talked about this, and this really covers the next two bullets, and then I'll move on. Encryption can be done extraordinarily wrong. So it's important to actually, try to at least apply some best practices here. NIST mandates the use of Advanced Encryption Standard 256 Rigendell cipher with a 256-bit key, 256-bit key as the minimum standard. Best practice is generally above 512 bits. I say all that, nobody's expected to be an encryption standard, but again, you can do it wrong. So applying old encryption doesn't really help, even though it might make you feel like you can check the box and saying, hey, there's encryption in play. It's best to have a worthwhile encryption mechanism in play. There's a really easy to use and interesting tool that I enjoy called VeraCrypt. And it's free and it's an easy way to layer encryption mechanisms. So you can have multiple wrappings. It's called cipher cascading. So you can basically encrypt it in one mechanism, you can encrypt it in another different one, and so on, and it makes it that much more secure. And it also allows for hidden inner containers. You can have some fun with it. But that's a great way to encrypt things without relying on, the potentially flawed qualities of some original equipment manufacturer or whatever. This is an open source standard that you can use and define on your own. All right, I'm gonna keep moving here. This is the longest, this 3.8 is the longest section that I'll cover, and then I'll turn it over to Vivi here in a minute. But you can see additional media protection controls, including physical locks, cages that prevent access to removable media. I'll talk for a second about different types of controls when I get into the physical protection, but things like administrative controls like badge display, technical controls like registering, whitelisting, removable media, or disabling device drivers and auto run functionality. These are all mechanisms that can control the use of removable media. Personally owned devices can be a bit more difficult to monitor and control in a work from home environment, but you can still make use of that for the protected resources that you're working with. One quick best practice: if somebody finds a random thumb drive on the floor, it can be useful to have a turn-in procedure, or at least an amnesty box that folks can just drop it into without worrying, and then a periodic review from the security personnel on an isolated computer to see what it is and maybe return it to its owner. But if absent that, just it's good to back up your data. It's good to throw stuff away if it's unlabeled and unclaimed, because that's sort of an easy way to implant an infection in a sort of a drive-by fashion. Backup controlled unclassified information at storage locations. This can often be an afterthought because it's backup, right? But it still needs all the protections that we've been talking about. And you can consider, there's both the user level information and then there's system level information, like the system state, operating system, application software licenses, and so on, that can reveal vulnerabilities or potential infection mechanisms in your primary media. So it's useful to protect both sets of that. Sorry, I see a message in chat asking to clarify U.S. persons, lawful resident alien, U.S. citizen, also a U.S. corporation is considered a U.S. person. So just to be clear, it's any legal resident alien, any U.S. domestic company, these are considered U.S. persons for purposes of that sort of dissemination control that I talked about a few minutes ago. It's a great question. Thanks for asking that. Okay, personnel security. This one's going to be short, but it's a particularly, in my opinion, it's an easy thing to get. It's an easy thing to either overdo or to just forget about completely. So the fine balance is really in between. And so often, we think of this as background screening and vetting. Criminal checks, financial checks, reference checks when you're hiring a person. That's good. Ongoing and continuing evaluation is the best practice, though. So it's important to consider, but it needs to be balanced with employee privacy and trust. You don't want to create a culture of mistrust within your organization, but it is useful to keep an eye out for traditional indicators of compromise and build a program to encourage reporting about attempts to access unauthorized information, collecting, storing, retaining controlled unclassified information that's unrelated to a person's job, contacts that indicate the employee is affiliated with a foreign intelligence agency or maybe involved in corporate espionage. I mean, this stuff happens, right? And the anecdotally, we learned from terrorist activities that over 80% of information is available at an unclassified level. So all these additional controls that we're talking about for unclassified information is actually needed to stop terrorist attacks and to stop foreign intelligence activity from stealing intellectual property and from conducting espionage and subversion, sedition, and so on. So keeping an eye out for those types of contacts can be a reportable event. But your people better, so you got to tailor this program so you're not creating this culture of mistrust, as I mentioned. But generally, disregard for security policies, lax attitudes towards marking, securing, transporting documents, or actual or unauthorized disclosure can be an indicator that there's something wrong. And certainly encouraging other employees to do the same. Unexplained wealth and travel is a traditional kind of espionage indicator, but probably very rare in what you'll be working with. But disgruntled attitude, signs of extraordinary personal stress, major life events can be a trigger for recruitment. But again, this is not a one-size-fits-all thing. The best practice is to know your people, to create a culture of caring about your employees, and charging the frontline leaders with actually knowing their people. Out of the ordinary, but that also is a prevention mechanism, right? They're not going to be likely to smuggle out controlled information if they love their coworkers and their job. Anyway, I want to move on here. I mentioned, return, when folks are terminated and transferred, you can think of the janitor who's been around for 30 years. Their key ring is just enormous, right? It's got keys for everything. Well, that's what happens a lot of times with employees and access control. So it's a good idea, you turn in the badges, change the access control lists, and make sure you go through that in particular. Our next topic is Family 3 TAC 10, physical protection. Physical access control is something that I think I've seen personally often relegated to facilities management without proper coordination with information technology controls. And I think that this is something worth consideration. There's a series of controls that you can implement, and I'll show them to you briefly, but I'm not going to spend too much time on them. The idea, though, with this family is to prevent unauthorized access, damage, disruption, tampering, and eavesdropping, in summary. And this is another balancing act where you might want to have physical protections that are very effective, but may be inappropriate for your specific use case. A great example that I usually refer to in this case is like a guard dog and roving patrols. The guard dogs are really helpful, and of course roving patrols as well. But if you're living, if you have a company that's in a residential area, having a bunch of guard dogs barking and cause, that may not be appropriate, right? And who wants to deal with the liability of a guard dog biting somebody who's trying to break in? I mean, it's easier just to call police, right? But they're deterrent, they're directive, they're preventative, they're detective. They can even be in some ways corrective access control mechanisms. So they're serving all these functions, but then we have the idea of a compensating control that can kind of make up for, well, guard dogs aren't appropriate, so we'll use closed circuit TV and motion sensor lights and a good alarm system on our fence or on our building that's going to call for the police. So guard dog would do basically all those things and probably stop the intruder in their tracks if they were trained properly, but yeah, maybe not so appropriate. So this is another balancing act that you have to tailor suit, but it's kind of a fun one to think through and work through. The derived security requirements, periodic physical security evaluations will basically determine your compliance with this, and this is part of the self-assessment mechanism that's prescribed by this guidance from NIST. But even doing it to spot check your logs. How are we doing with escorts? We have somebody coming in to fix the whatever on the building or unclog a toilet or whatever you have going on in the facility. What are we doing with those visitors? Do we actually have the badge that says escort required, and are we actually monitoring their activity as the cleaning crew comes in or whatever that third party visitor is? That can often be the difference between an effective physical security control program or not, because you can have all the controls in the world, but if somebody's just walking in unescorted and doing what they want with the place, then it's hard to maintain these controls in their effect. All right, last thing that I'll go over. Here's a list of the controls that I just kind of summarized: deterrent, directive, preventive, detective, corrective, compensating, and recovery. And each of these can be implemented using technical, administrative, and physical means. And so you might consider, as you're planning this out, how to layer these in so that you've got effective security control functions across each of the three main categories, and they work together. Just like, the families overlap, certainly your controls and implementations can and should overlap so that you don't have any major gap where you're only relying on administrative controls, let's say people following the rules to deter and prevent or direct the right activities. So all that said, I'm going to pause for a second. I'm going to queue up Vivi, who's going to walk through families 311 and 312.
Thank you, Justin. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. Yes. So let me pick up where Justin stopped and start with risk assessment, which is point 311 of the NIST publication. And I'm going to change gears actually, and instead of talking about controls at such a specific level, I want to bring it up a little bit into the level of risk and risk assessments. Risk assessments are a key part of an effective risk management process for any organization, and they facilitate the decision-making on how to address and mitigate risks that you might find in your company. And this is true not only for information security risks, but for all risks, including operational risks and the human factor as well. Risk assessments are important. It's important to know that risk assessments are not a once and done action, or something that you just do once a year to satisfy a regulatory requirement, or because the government is demanding it if you work for the government or one of your customers. Risk assessments and a risk management program is an ongoing process. And it's important for you to know this and to treat it accordingly, because that's the only way that it can be effective. Risk assessments and risk management in general can be daunting to certain organizations, depending on the size, or for certain individuals that might not have been exposed to how to process risk. So I want to, give you a couple of pointers that I have learned through my years doing risk management. Is one, there is no standard format. A lot of people come to me and ask me, how do you evaluate risk? What are your templates? And there is no standard format. It is an exercise that should fit your organization and your risk appetite. It is not precise science. Risk assessments are not usually 100% objective. There's a subjective element to it that requires input from the individuals that are your subject matter experts to develop this process. Also remember that once you identify a risk, there is a couple of things that you can do with it. You can mitigate it to acceptable levels. You can eliminate it, or you can transfer it, which might be the case of outsourcing it if necessary. And just to make sure we're on the same page, I want to just put here a quick definition of risk. Risk is a measure of the extent to which an entity is threatened by a potential circumstance or event, and is typically a function of the adverse impact that it will have on your organization and the likelihood of that occurrence. So it's basically, you find something that is needs to be fixing, or that is providing a vulnerability for organization. You need to identify the impact that it will have and how likelihood is that it's going to happen, or that it is happening. So how to assess risk? Assessing risk, you need to identify the threats, the vulnerabilities, and like I said, their likelihood and their impact. And you need to do this for your operations, for assets, for individuals, and also for external parties. It's very important that you don't forget the risk that is generated by external parties, which nowadays is not such a big deal because we have had so many breaches caused by third parties, by vendors, right? So you need to make sure that when you perform risk assessments, you're bringing to the fold your vendors, your service providers, your contractors, but also any other individuals that might have access to your systems, or that might have access to non-public information that you want to protect. If you want to learn a little bit more about it, or a lot more about how to go about it, NIST has a special publication, which is 830, which is called Guide for Conducting Risk Assessments, which is an awesome document for you to learn how to perform a risk assessment. A couple of other things I want to mention is, since cost, timeliness are something that are important factors when doing anything in an organization, really, risk assessments should attempt to reduce this, and they should be easy. They should be as efficient as you can make them. I have seen complex risk assessments and complex risk programs being implemented at different organizations, which are not easily understood by those who need to provide input to it. So they don't become really adopted. So when you perform a risk assessment or develop one, or your risk management program, make sure that you go as simple as you can, so stakeholders can buy into it and make it efficient and effective. It's better to have something simpler that everyone understands and they can contribute than to try to do something beautiful that addresses all aspects of risk management. You can start small and then make it grow within your organization. So just in the next slide, so we can go into the derived security requirements. Here, I'm going to get a little bit more specific on assessing the risk in your network. One of the things that you need to do, if you're not doing it already, is to scan for vulnerabilities in your systems and ancillary resources that you might have as well. And this needs to be done in a periodic and consistent basis. So you do have a method of identifying the risk and addressing it through the year and through your cycles. So you need to determine what to scan first. So that's where risk assessments come into place. You need to scan not only servers, but also printers, scanners, and copiers that might be attached to your network. But again, you need to assess the risk that each of those pieces generate for your organization if something happens to them. And then you determine what should be scanned and how often and how deep. Now, what are these scans are for? Scans are programs, right, that will look eyes into your network, into your resources, into your connections, and they will determine if the patch levels are appropriate, if the ports and protocols and services that should be accessible are, and the ones that shouldn't be are locked out. And one of the most important things is to make sure that improper configured or incorrectly configured systems or controls are identified, so you can fix those. Those are, low-hanging fruit that it can cause a lot of issues for an organization if you have not done so. What scanning software you should adopt to do these scans? There's many choices there. My suggestion is that the software should facilitate the evaluation of the vulnerabilities that you found. So I would consider using a product that expresses vulnerabilities in the common vulnerability and exposures, which is called CVE, naming convention, which you can easily Google and learn about this vulnerability and how to remediate it. Also, there are products that express vulnerabilities using the common vulnerability scoring system, a CVSS, which will help identify how critical those vulnerabilities that this program found are. So it will help you assess how to risk rank them and how to tackle them first. Point 3 is remediating the risk. In the case risks identified by scans or your network are identified, you, again, like I said, you need to deem how relevant they are. Consideration of risk influences and prioritization is important because you cannot solve every issue that you find. So using those two things that I mentioned, the CVE and CVSS, will help you rank a lot of those vulnerabilities and see how you can tackle them. Of course, that's not a solution in all. You have to look at this as a holistic process and see how they affect your network and your organization as a whole. Justin, if you go to slide 3 on security requirements. I know that we have a limited amount of time, so I'm going quickly through it. So periodically assess the security controls in organizational systems to determine if the controls are effective in their security application. Security controls are safeguards, right, that protect your systems and information processes that pass through those systems. And they make sure that the access is appropriate and that there is nobody trying to maliciously do something to your systems or to access your systems without authority and cause any issues to them, like data loss or stealing them. Security control assessments help identify weaknesses and deficiencies early in the development process. And they also provide assurances that the controls in place are functioning as expected. So we put these controls in place for systems, for processes. And again, this is not only within a system, this also applies for processes and people, to make sure that we have those security controls in place to mitigate risks, to prevent risky things from happening. The assessments, assessments should result in reports. So you're going to go through the exercise of periodically reviewing your security controls. You're going to make sure that you have good reports. And then again, I'll go for simple with enough information to allow for action. So those reports need to be shared with the stakeholders and with the individuals that actually can remediate the issues. And like I said, do not provide too much information, as you know, it is unnecessary. And if you provide too little, it might not allow for proper action and mitigation of those risks. So finding a happy medium on creating those reports is important as well. Self-assessments, continuous monitoring, scannings, those are all methods that you can use to assess the security of your systems, your processes, and your people. If your company has an audit function, they are the third line of defense, and they will review your processes as well. So they will have audit programs in place based on standard procedures that you might already have documented. Or if you don't, they will go into your processes and look step by step to identify those weaknesses. If you do not have an audit function, I will highly recommend to look into how audit organizations do it and try to emulate a little bit of what they do, as they are very efficient. To learn a little bit more about the security requirements, NIST has a publication which is called 853, and it provides guidance on security and privacy controls for systems and organizations. The next 3.12.2 is to develop and implement plans of action designed to correct deficiencies and reduce or eliminate vulnerabilities in organizational systems. The plan of action is actually a key document in the information security program. So you go through all the effort of create risk assessments, identify risks, assess your systems. Now what? So now you need a plan of action. And it is important to have a clear plan on how to tackle and mitigate those identified vulnerabilities, and a clear explanation of what you're going to tackle first. So ranking these, again, become a very important exercise. So you can tackle them in a manner that you will reduce risk using the resources appropriate for the things that you are tackling. Also, a well-documented document will go a long way to instill trust on your customers, on regulators if you have to deal with them as well. So if you have a good document in place that shows how you identify the risks, what your action plan is, your timing for addressing those, and it is a document that is not done once a year, but it is constantly being updated as you identify risks, it will provide a lot of trust. And it will actually make individuals look less under the hood to see exactly how things are happening. Not meaning that you're doing it less than, you know, a stellar job, right? But it is great to have it documented of how much effort and what you're doing about it. 13.12.3. Monitor security controls on an ongoing basis to ensure the continued effectiveness of controls, called continuous monitoring. Continuous monitoring programs are great because they identify threats, vulnerabilities, and weaknesses faster. Continuous monitoring requires implementation of usually systems that will be able to look at connections and processes and resources on an ongoing basis and flag every time something strange happens, or flag if they find a vulnerability. Continuous monitoring, usually you think about them as a program on a network, but it can also be outside of the network. Remember, right, information security is not only systems, but also processes and people. So you can have continuous monitoring to look at processes and people. It's just a process that you need to develop that will regularly be testing your security controls that you have in place. And this is usually done by individuals themselves. Providing access to security information on a continual basis will require you again to create reports and dashboards that will provide an overall view of what is happening within a department or within your IT organization. That will allow organizational officials to take a look at things on one page, visual, and be able to make risk management decisions. So that's something that a continuous monitoring tool can do for you, having those dashboards. Effectiveness is further enhanced when you format the information that you obtain for those continuous monitoring tools in an actionable manner that will allow individuals that do need to address those issues to address it effectively. There is a guidance, again, a NIST guidance, SP 800-137. It provides guidance on how to implement those continuing monitoring tools. So I want to put it out there. And last but not least, the last point here is to develop, document, and periodically update system security plans that describe system boundaries, environments, operation, how security requirements are implemented, and that sort. And I think I mentioned it a couple of times here, how important this is. You need to create a living, breathing document. Again, not a once and done, not a once a year update, a document that you update, but something that you should be updating every time that a significant risk is identified or mitigated. Every time that you make changes to your network, every time you make changes to your processes or to individuals, have this document, probably a set of documents, and keep them alive, keep them updated. They will provide the blueprint for you for how to tackle those risks once they are identified, by knowing exactly what your environment is, exactly knowing what your controls to mitigate risks are, to bring risks to acceptable levels. You have then the whole picture of what your information security or your cybersecurity program looks like. And any changes to it, you will easily know how they will impact not only your organization or your department, but your organization as a whole. I think there is a document, yes. So there's a publication 800-171, the supplemental material within it, which is the one that we're looking at, that provides templates for those system security plans. So I hope this information was useful, and I have to pass this to Justin, who I need to pass this to? Sorry.
We're going back to Paul, and I apologize for we got excited and ran over a little bit, so Paul's going to have a tour to get back on track. Sorry about that.
That's okay, Justin. Thank you very much, Paul.
Well, it's a very exciting subject, and we're all very passionate about here, as you can all probably tell. So in order to make sure that we kind of fit everything in that we're looking to discuss, at least for our initial presenters, I am going to do a little bit of abridgment for these last couple of things, because we are going to be talking about them in the second half of this workshop. So we are going to be going into them in more detail, but ultimately looking at family 3.13, which is systems and communications protection. Essentially, this is just making sure that we're protecting the company boundaries, that we determine what those boundaries are, so we have a clear delineation of what our internal network is versus our internal, using devices like firewalls, routers, and gateways, making sure that we have proper architectural designs in place to support proper information security, things like system development, lifecycle management. If possible, making sure that our network is split up, if we can, into sub-networks where we are minimizing the amount of activity on the area of our network that contains CUI through things like DMZs, or restricting which devices have internet access. You can also take a look at the rules that are in place for our network communication devices, our firewalls, making sure that we're restricting communications and only allowing in necessary traffic, and that we're also protecting sessions that are taking place remotely or over secure connections such as SSH, making sure that we're using HTTPS instead of regular HTTP and things like that. Making sure that we have, again, as we mentioned earlier, that user administrator separation of functionality, that our operating system is updated and configured in a way so we are not sharing technological resources, so that there is not memory dump onto different programs. A little more technical problem, but still something to consider. Making sure that we have what's known as split tunneling disabled when we are doing any sort of remote work. This prevents mitigation of information from a personal network to a work-based network. Making sure that we're encrypting our CUI when we're transmitting it. And Justin spoke a little bit about different encryption mechanisms, making sure that those are properly meeting particular federal standards and requirements. If we are handling any cryptographic keys within our organization, making sure that those are stored and backed up. Making sure that our remote sessions are set to timeout and disconnect over a certain period of time, making sure that we're making a good and secure use of collaborative computing devices like conference phones, webcams, and microphones, making sure that we have mobile code maintenance that is sound. So if we have any systems that use things like Java, JavaScript, ActiveX, any pieces of code that are shared via multiple programs, that those are updated and restricted to only necessary functions. If we have voice over IP systems in our company, we want to make sure that those are maintained properly and monitored, and ideally on a separate network from our internal one that's handling our data. And we want to protect our CUI that's at rest, making sure that our backups are secured and any CUI that is stored on any sort of removable media is given proper security considerations as well. And then moving on to the final family very quickly, this is regarding system and information integrity. Main concepts we're looking at here is network and system monitoring, making sure that we're identifying our system flaws, monitoring our traffic to detect any sort of attacks that come in, both at the internal and external level. Making sure that we have code protection in place, which most commonly is antivirus and malware, both at the server and the client level, that we're regularly doing scans, and that we are updating our definitions as new ones are released. And then finally, that we are monitoring any system security alerts that may come out. We can use different resources like the U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, or US CERT. They provide a lot of information on cybersecurity awareness and alerts that come out. Make sure that you maintain situational awareness, and then make any changes to your systems as needed once those security updates are released. So that's me rocketing through those last couple things. And now I will go ahead and turn it over to Anna Valai Fitzsimmons, who is from PTAC. She is going to be speaking about one of these systems that is needed to report your self-assessment results that are used by DoD contractors when selecting contracts. Anna, take it away.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Paul. So yes, I am with the Procurement Technical Assistance Center. And for those of you not aware of who we are, what we do, I'm going to do a brief overview of that because I'm required to, and we'll talk about SPURS. So we help businesses sell to the government, and a little bit more about that. We're actually a program of the Department of Defense. And our centers serve as a resource for businesses that are pursuing and performing under government contracts. What does that mean? Our box is government contracting. We help large and small businesses who want to sell to the government and anything and everything that is government contracting. In addition to working with small businesses and large businesses on all levels of selling, military, federal, state, or municipal, we also work closely with the military, of course, other government, federal agencies, state agencies, and large government prime contractors, and helping them fulfill their contracting and subcontracting goals. And we do that in a variety of ways. We work closely with our partner organizations. I want to thank the MEP and AIM, as well as the Mohawk Valley Community College for having me here today. I really appreciate it. Our PTAC, where I'm located, is in Rochester, New York. I cover 9 counties, designated New York State Finger Lakes region, but I'm one of 94 PTACs, and excuse me, and one of 7 in New York State. So if you're not sure who covers your territory, I'm gonna put my email in the chat box if you want a copy of this presentation or need to know who can assist you further with government contracting needs. I'm happy to connect you directly with that individual. Or you can easily go to our association website, National Association website, or DLA small business page website. All right, so what do we do? No cost services, or as I like to say, prepaid for. Every PTAC has a host organization. My host organization is the County Monroe Industrial Development Agency. That means we're funded through the DoD, our host organization, and Congress. Congress loves this program. So there's really 3 main functions of what we do: training, workshops, webinars, more and more these days, of course. Government to business matchmakers or networking, where we bring buyers and sellers together. But really the bulk of our work is done in one-on-one contracting counseling. And I'm not going to read through that. I'll let you guys look through that on your own. So let's talk a little bit about C, which is the topic of the day. And really what it's all about is securing the DoD supply chain. And when I think of manufacturers, and again, somebody said this earlier, kudos to you because you really have a lot of extra hoops to jump through. And if you want to bid on a solicitation by the DoD nowadays more and more, not only do you need cyber, you need your JCP or you need ITAR. So those are all registrations. And I speak in acronyms. We do have an acronyms page on our website, so ask questions in the chat and I can respond to you afterwards. But I think, as I understand it, the majority of participants in today's workshop already do business with the DoD, so probably very familiar with these terms. So just a quick eye chart about the CMMC practice progression as seen through the lens of the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, which is where the PTAC will be moving under come October. So just something for you to kind of help gauge where all this is going to that is being talked about today in terms of cyber hygiene. Here's the projected rollout. It was mentioned earlier. The real takeaway is that starting any new DoD contract will have CMMC requirements starting in fiscal year 26. That's every single one of them. However, you're getting in the game now, and it's really important that you do. It's going to give you an advantage to winning on government contracts, in particular DoD contracts. So please take advantage of it and take advantage of the assistance that's being offered here today. All right, I'm doing the quick update on SPURS. And this is in reference to the interim rule DFARS 252-204-719/20. And you could see uploading your scores in SPURS as well as your plan of action milestones or your POAMs are going to become very important, and it's your next step. I understand you guys are going to be talking about that in breakout session this afternoon, which is great. All right, so what is SPURS? Supplier Performance Risk Assessment. It is where you post your basic assessment score for the NIST SP 800-171. All right, we're going to follow the bouncing ball here. Here's the path to basic assessment. Let's see if I could just do this. All right, so all of you, as I understand, majority of you are already registered in SAM. That's great. What's going to be important is for you to review your SAM registration and see who your electronic business point of contact is. Under points of contact, there's 4 categories in SAM. Points of contact is the 4th. That's going to be critical. And then if you are already selling to the DoD and doing business with them, you already are in the PI network. You're probably submitting all your vendor invoices in WAF. So that's great. If you are not the one responsible for submitting your WAF invoices, or you're not sure who's doing that, you need to find that out because they're going to be your contract administrator, and it's important to determine internally, really, this is where you've got to come up with a mini process. Who's going to be posting these scores? Who's going to be responsible for managing them? So keep that in mind. You can create additional user roles, establish user accounts in there. So just make sure that internally you're building that into your process of who's going to be maintaining the SPURS score. Easy for me to say, SPURS score within the PI network, and then entering those basic assessments and updating them. Because the fact of the matter is, you could do your first assessment and you could have a negative score. You should still post it. It's okay. Okay, it's not going to preclude you from getting a contract with the Department of Defense. However, your plan of action is going to become critically important, and what dates that you assign to them in terms of making any corrections that are necessary. All right, so PI is your Procurement Integrated Enterprise Environment. I have a link here for you. It is the single sign-on portal for SPURS. And then additionally, the second link is great because it's going to take you to the whole SPURS, everything you need to know about SPURS and uploading your score in there. But of course, you have assistance. You don't have to go it alone with doing that. You can text that as well. All right. So for those of you that are familiar with the PI network, and you go in there and you see icons that are similar to this, I can assure you that if you've never done your spurs yet, you're not going to see this icon, even though it's going to tell you, oh, you're supposed to see this icon. You're not going to see it. There's going to be a few back steps that you're going to have to take, and most likely it's going to involve a phone call to the Ogden service desk in order to get that on there. But before you can post your assessment score. All right. But once you are in there and you do get, and if you need help getting in there, I do this with folks over the phone all the time. It's really not that difficult. So just give me a holler, or I'll refer you to the right PTAC. Then you can select your NIST SP 800 171 assessment. And it's really important, and this really becomes more important to companies that have multiple cage codes involved, but I'm gonna guess that the majority of you are small businesses. You probably just have one cage code, and that the highest level owner is gonna be the one required to be listed here. So then you get into another dilemma in SPURS when you're going to register, is that the highest level owner, again, can't create this. So that is going to be all part of a phone call to the help desk to get in there and create your SPURS cyber vendor user role. So that's going to be step one, is creating that SPURS cyber vendor user role. This is just a little eye chart about the hierarchy management. If you do happen to have multiple cage codes, who's the highest level owner of the company or the division. Sometimes, depending on the contract, it may only apply, the cyber controls may only apply to the division. So you want to make sure that you check your cage hierarchy if you do have multiple ones in SPURS, and make any corrections that you need in SAM. So first it's SAM, DLA, SPURS. So once you do get in, this is the snapshot of what it's going to look like to add your assessment, okay? You're going to add the date, the score. As you can see here, here's on 5/19/20, scores 90. Basic level of confidence, the standards used, and so forth. And then an enclave really means that it's not the whole company, it's just a division of the company, but otherwise you are an enterprise or vendor. And then when you enter your assessment results, and again, this is really just a quick go through, but when you enter your assessment results, you have to include your cage hierarchy and your HLO. So that's how it gets in there. You've put the date, you've put the score, you're assessing the scope, plan of action. The scope means what does the requirement within the solicitation that's stating that you have to have CMMC, that it has CMMC controls. What is the scope? Is it the whole company? Is it a division? So on and so forth. And then your SSP, whether that's been assessed, so that's coming up, and then your version or revision of your version of your plan, and then the date that you anticipate to fix any of these issues. So that was a lot to unpack. And for those of you that aren't already in SAM for whatever reason, we can get you through SAM really quickly. Really what's going to be important on this eye chart summary is to register in the PI network if you're already in SAM, establish your CAM, obtain your SPURS user roles, and then accessing the supplier performance risk assessment by creating a header, entering the assessment results, and making sure that you have a POAM in place that indicates when you are going to be able to fix or resolve any issues that your company is currently working on. I want to highlight just a couple quick important things because it is going to impact everyone. Beta SAM and SAM are merging. It's official, May 24th. Be prepared. It's going to be, you're not going to lose any of your information, but it's all going to be in one system. And then because I'm talking to manufacturers today, I really, really want to let you know about Navy Fleet Week in Buffalo. Can you believe there's a Navy Fleet Week in Buffalo, right? So the Navy approached our PTAC. We're going to be hosting them as they present doing business with the Navy. You know who's got a lot of money right now in the DoD? The Navy does, to do a multitude of different things. I encourage you all to attend, network with Navy small business, and see what opportunities are available for you. And you know, hopefully by then you'll be well advanced and prepared to do business with the Department of Defense and have your spurs to date. But if you have any questions, I will put my email, as I said, in the chat box. I think I've kept us some time. I'm going to be turning this over to, let's see, back to Justin and Corey and Everton. And I really appreciate you guys having me here. I am going to be jumping off, so thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Very, very nice job. It's really great for you to decide to join us here and provide the information. We appreciate it.
I appreciate the invite. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Anna. So now to round out our speaker list, we're going to have Justin up again, and it's going to be followed by Corey and me, and we'll be talking about some stuff purely about the rules of the grant. Go for it, Justin.
Thanks, Everton. So real quick, we're going to talk about a program that we've launched at the Global Cybersecurity Institute at RIT, and a new opportunity associated with that program. So first up, the Global Cybersecurity Institute is a new creation within RIT. It was founded last year, and we have a state-of-the-art educational facility, a cyber range and training center, which Vivi and I work with very closely, as well as an outreach security assessment lab called the Eaton Cybersecurity Safe Lab, where we do outreach and security assurance testing, penetration testing for hire, basically as a component of faculty and student partnerships to help companies make their networks and devices more secure and evaluate the security claims of security vendors. So during the summer last year, you know, we were planning out what to do with the cyber range and what do we think we needed to do. And originally we had planned for an in-person offering in the fall, but then COVID happened, right? And everybody got laid off. So we said, well, you know, there's a lot of demand for, workers in the cybersecurity field. And so we created what we're calling today a cybersecurity boot camp, really an initial entry program for folks without a cyber background, without even an IT background, to enter the security landscape and workforce. So we launched that last year in a full-time cohort. And we've actually just this week launched our 4th full-time cohort. It's entirely for the deaf and hard of hearing community, the 4th cohort, which is pretty exciting for us. But in any case, I'm going to turn it over to Vivi, who's going to tell you about a specific offering that we've got, a new development coming up this summer.
Thank you, Justin. Hello, everyone again. I want to talk to you guys quickly about our part-time offering, which is going to be our next upcoming cohort that is slated to start at the end of June. It is a 30-week program, 100% online, and it will provide you rapid upskilling, meaning that you can, whatever field you're in, you take this bootcamp, and in 30 weeks, you have all those fundamental skills necessary for you to become a cybersecurity professional. This is a very dynamic program that we're offering. Is very different than many other boot camps that you are going to find out there. We have a lot of hands-on tasks and real-world scenarios. We have intense interactions with faculty and your fellow students as well. And just like Justin said, you do not have to have a technology background to participate in this boot camp. The bootcamp effort, we are estimating for the part-time bootcamp to be between 10 and 20 hours of effort per week. And we say 10 to 20 because it depends. If you do have some IT knowledge, or if you are an IT professional, it will be closer to the 10 hours. If you do not have an IT background, we're estimating 10, 20, maybe a little bit more for you to be able to get through this program. What is important for you to know, there is no classroom setting. This is a fully immersed experience where we're going to simulate that you are working as a co-op for Brickwall Cyber, which is our fictitious company. You start working there, you're going to get promoted a couple of times. You're going to start with IT fundamentals, and We're going to promote you into a security position and then promote you through the time being there into more senior levels within cybersecurity. Through that process, we're going to provide you all the information that you need. This is an asynchronous process, meaning you're going to work at your own pace. Like I said, there is no classroom setting, but there are significant interactions with individuals every week, one-on-one interactions, which is very different than other boot camps. A couple of the perks is at the end of the program, you can get 2 vouchers and you can choose among those 3 here on your screen. You have access to Pluralsight, which is a vendor that we partner with to provide you videos and content. Again, I said the personal attention, we consider the groups are small. We are targeting 20 students per bootcamp. So it's very individualized. And like I said, we meet with you at least once a week. And every time that you need assistance, there is someone there to talk to you personally. And of course, we're going to provide you with ongoing support for networking afterwards. Here, the exposure to cybersecurity skills here on the screen quickly, and we can share the slide so you can see it. And on the next one, what tools you're going to be exposed to. So you know that those are the tools that are used currently in the field. A little bit of financials, the tuition is $10,000. It includes those 2 certification vouchers. We do have significant scholarships in place if you need them. So please, when you apply, also apply for the scholarship so we can consider you for those. And there is also financial aid available if you need it. I want to mention quickly that this is not a college course, but is a professional certificate instead that will give you those critical fundamental skills for you to get into the cybersecurity field. Why train existing employees? And this maybe is a message not only for you, the individual, but you, the managers that have individuals, and you have a need for cybersecurity staff. Here is a graph that we put together. If you want us to go more in detail, please reach out to us. We'll be glad to meet with you and talk about it. But it is cheaper to train individuals that you already know are great individuals working for your organization. The recruiting costs are none. The risk of a bad hire also non-existent. The onboarding time of training through our bootcamp and then getting them ready to do their job is shorter and less expensive than hiring someone from the outside. And that's it. If you guys have any questions, there is my information, my phone number, my email, or you can reach out to Justin as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vivian. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Justin. And at this point, what we're going to do is go to the last item in the first part of the agenda. And Corey and I will be talking about cohort membership and cyber grants. So Corey, please go.
Thank you, Everton. And okay, so here I am. I'm back. Again, my name is Corey Albrecht with AIM. I also would like to thank all the presenters we had, Vivian, Justin, Anna, and Paul. Truly a fantastic job. And this is a true example of the cybersecurity assets that we have in the state of New York. So I feel like we're all lucky to have each and every one of you. So thanks again. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the New York State Cybersecurity Assistance? So this is a grant program which was awarded to Mohawk Valley Community College in May of last year. We have 3 main objectives or tasks associated with this grant program. The first task is to establish a marketing and an outreach plan for state development, which leverages the state's regional assets, including a series of 5 webinars and or workshops. And this morning's workshop is a true example of that. Next slide. Okay, task number 2, along with the workshops, we should have a series of webinars which will train companies how to perform the NIST 800-171 self-assessment and will include guidelines on how to access self-assessment tools. This grant has a goal of connecting with a minimum of 250 Department of Defense companies, okay, engaging through these types of workshops and webinars. And each and every one of you manufacturers that are on this workshop this morning are part of our cohort now and are helping us meet the requirements of this grant. 250 companies enrolled in the cohort. And then finally, task number 3 is to assist those companies that may not have the financial and staff resources to perform an assessment on their own. At least 67 DoD manufacturing companies will be awarded through the grant with an 800-171 assessment performed by one of our cybersecurity implementation teams. Now, this is a $7,500 assessment project, of which $6,000 will be provided for through the New York State Cybersecurity Assistance Grant. And of the 67 financially awarded organizations, they should be from as many regions across the state of New York as possible. Next slide. And like all grant programs, you are successful because of the teams that you can build. You're successful with partnerships that you can forge. As I mentioned earlier, this grant originated at the state level from Empire State Development. It was awarded to Mohawk Valley Community College as the financial managers and the statewide administrators of this grant program. And then immediately we recognized three very key partners. The first one being Fuse Hub. And then next we had Twin State Technologies and MTech, which is the MEP Center for the Hudson Valley region. Next slide. And then with that, I'll turn it back over to Everton. Over to you, Everton.
Thank you very much, Corey. So folks, that's me. I'm the MEP Solutions Director for Fuse Hub. So what I'm going to do is quickly tell you, about how we approach this grant. What we decided to do in order to achieve the objective is that we would create a cohort of manufacturers. And for this cohort, we were looking at having 320 members. Where did we get that number from? Very simple, 6 to 7 from the financial grant, plus 250 that Corey mentioned, and we just round up a little bit to 320. But what are you going to get from this really? You are going to get a free membership, networking among cohort members in the DoD supply chain, and that's very, very useful to see what your competitor is doing. So in addition to that, you'll be getting virtual office hours from Paul Laporte, and you've heard Paul before, and Paul is a resident expert and is really very good at teaching and training our folks. You'll also get an access to our archive of cybersecurity webinars and workshops, and Corey just mentioned that before, but we've got a bunch of them, so you'll get access to that. All right, so there's a 5-part webinar series that we did before, and we have that archive, and you'll be able to see that. You'll have access to online training program for self-assessment through Teachable, and we're going to be looking at that later on, right after this meeting. The training is going to provide content up to CMMC level 3 equivalent. Not really, we're not a certified body, but we'll give you as much information as we can. And of course, as Corey mentioned, some cohort members will be eligible for a grant to cover the personalized assessment. That's where the $6,000 come in, and companies will be required to contribute $1,500 of their own money. But you'll also get a letter of completion, and this is very important. Cohort members that finish the program will have this letter, and you can really show your potential customers that, hey, we're cybersecure, or at least we're conscious. A similar letter of completion is going to go to the grant winners. Okay, and we will prepare you for meeting CMMC level 3. So what's the objective here? We have objective that by the end of this month, we wanted to enroll 320 DoD members and complete 6 to 7 physical assessments. We're not there yet, but we're getting very, very close, and we're glad you're here as a part of it. So could I have the next slide, please, Paul? So how do we plan to prepare you for this? Well, the first thing to look at is that we started this a while ago, last September, and we've had these webinars and workshops. But today's workshop is really hands-on training, and that's one of the ways that we're going to do this. In addition to that, you're going to go through the Teachable program that Paul has set up. We have 9 modules there. We're covering all 14 families as we did today. And so the learning program will have an assessment, a quiz or something after each module. But at the end of it, you'll have a certificate of conclusion at the end of the final module. So that's really what it is that we're trying to do here. Okay, so at this point, what I'm going to do is I want to move on because we're going to get to the next step. So I want to thank you Corey, got to thank you and Franca and Paul, Vivian, Justin, and Anna for your wonderful presentations that you just did. And this is going to conclude the presentation portion of today's event. We're going to have a 15-minute break. Before we do so, though, I would like to ask Kim Lloyd to address a very important login requirement because we need to do this ahead of the next session. So Kim, could you please take it away? And after
Yes.
Kim, we'll break for 15 minutes and then we'll come back to the main room. Kim,
Yes.
you're up.
Thank you. Thanks, Everton. So after the break, we'll break into breakout rooms. I've pre-assigned everyone to a breakout room. If you logged in with somebody else's login, you may or may not be assigned to a breakout room. So you'll have to, if you come back from break and you're not in a breakout room, you ping me, Kim Lloyd, and I'll try to get you into the correct breakout room. It is helpful for the people who used somebody else's login to change your name. If you go into the participants panel and you see me in parentheses, like a lot of people logged in as Nick Ants. So if you see Nick Ants and then me next to it, that's you. Hover over your name, click the more button, and you should be able to see something that says rename, and just rename yourself to give yourself your real name so I don't have 20 Nick Antses in a particular breakout room. So please feel free to do that. And the other thing to note is if you go to a breakout room and you have teachable login problems, come back to the main room because that's where Tanya will be to help you with teachable login issues. We'll get your issues cleared up right away and then get you back to your breakout room. So looking forward to seeing everybody after the break. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, everyone. So here we go. We are on break.